Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we'll be discussing the Rambam Hilchot Nachalot, Perek Zayin, Halacha Gimel. The Rambam writes as follows: Misha tava b'mayim she'ein lahem sof. If someone drowns in a area of water where there's no end seen, ubo edim shetava b'fneim v'avad zichrei, and witnesses come that they saw that he drowned. Aval pi she'en masiyan es ishtay l'chatchila. Initially, that's not enough to allow his wife to remarry, but nevertheless, when it comes to Yerusha, to inheritance, Harei hayarshim neichel alpiyam, the heirs could inherit based on their testimony. V'chein, then he goes on, similarly, in bo edim sharo shenafel l'geiv harayis v'nemarim, v'sharu etzolof v'aif eichelbay, v'shenidka b'mechama u'meis v'shenerag. Same thing would happen if witnesses come that he fell into a lion's den or leopards, or they saw him crucified, or birds eating from his body, or he was wounded in a war and died, or he was murdered. So the witnesses testified to all this, but they couldn't recognize his face. Simanim, they had real, reliable identification signs. Begufa in his body, and they recognized them. In all of these matters and similar ones, if he doesn't show up, there's no recognition of him afterwards, no one knows about his whereabouts, you could go into his inheritance based on this testimony, even though you can't marry off his wife, because I say, when it comes to the prohibition that carries with it the penalty of kares, they were more stringent. When it comes to monetary matters, if witnesses testify of something where the presumption is that he died, and they testify that they saw these things happening, and his memory was lost, no one knows about him afterwards, and we heard, the rumors are around that he died, we can inherit based on their testimony. Okay, so the Rambam over here gives examples of when we could rely on the witnesses, and one of the things is if they recognize his body, they have certain identification marks that are really solid identification marks that in his body, but it doesn't say anything about his clothing. What about his clothing? So the Achreinim say that from the Rambam we see clearly that it only helps if they testify they saw some signs that identify him on his body. But if it's on his garments, we do not accept that as being a form of evidence that he died. So the question is asked by Achreinim. One of them is the Chemda Shleima. What's the difference between the body or the clothing? So the Shvus Yankiv, one of the major poskim, says that you can't rely on garments because garments can be borrowed. People could be borrowing a garment. So maybe the person that they identified borrowed the garment from someone else, and that person is still alive. So then the question is asked by the Chemda Shleima from a biblical source. What does it say in the Torah that when Yaakov was shown the garment of Yosef that was immersed in blood, what did Yaakov say? He says, Chayira achlasai, a wild beast ate him. How could it be so sure? Could be Yosef lent his garment to someone else, and that other person was the one who was killed, devoured by the animal. How did he know that Yosef was no longer alive, if that's not identification? So the Sefer Nefesh Chaya gives the answer that when it comes to Simanim, when you want to establish a reality based on signs, on identification marks, there you have to be concerned that it might have been borrowed. Because identification marks in and of themselves is not a definite form of identifying. Because we could still imagine that maybe someone else is around that has the same signs. It's probably not likely, but it's probably very possible. That's why when you add to that fact that simanim are not definite, it only creates a strong presumption, but it's not definite, and you add to the fact that the garments could have been borrowed, then that doesn't work. But if this Tviyas Ayin, the Gemara in Chulin talks about how in matters of kashrus, if you see a piece of meat and you can identify with your eyes, oh, this is the piece of meat that I had before. In other words, I know it's the kosher meat, it's not some other cut of meat. A person who can use tvias ayin, that is something that works. And that's stronger than simanim. Simanim are only signs that point to the reality that this is the person that you're talking about, or this is the piece of meat that you're talking about. But when you have tvias ayin, when you can actually recognize it, you identify it because you see this is the one that we're talking about, in that case, that's stronger. That's a much more certain identification than simanim. And therefore, when there's tvias ayin, we don't consider the possibility of borrowing that was borrowed. That doesn't weaken it. And that's why Yaakov, who had tvias ayin, he recognized this is the garment. The fact that there could be shaila that could have been borrowed, that doesn't detract from it. In other words, what they're saying, what the Nefesh Chai is saying, that when you have merely a presumption based on external factors, then because it's a weak, though it works, but it's a weak identification. It's not intrinsic. And if it's not intrinsic, the fact that you could borrow it weakens it entirely. But when you base something on tvias ayin, that's an intrinsic way of identifying something. You just recognize it. And because you recognize it, the fact that it can be borrowed is unlikely, and therefore we don't take it into consideration. But it's a little bit difficult to say that because, after all, it is possible that people do lend garments. The Tzemach Tzedek in a tshuva gives a much more down-to-earth explanation. He says that when Yaakov said, "Kseinas b'ni," this is the cloak of my son, Chayerach Lasei, and a wild beast ate him, he wasn't saying this with halachic certainty that this is what happened, and that we're not concerned that it might have been borrowed, because here you can't even use the argument that the garment was on the person. Here the garment was not even on the body. He didn't find the body with a garment on it. Then you could say maybe it was borrowed by someone else. Here it was a garment without a body. So in this case, there's certainly no basis to say that this is the real body and this is halachically the real body. So when Yaakov said, this is the garment of my son, and he was eaten by an animal, he's not using a halachic determination with certainty that this is Yosef, but when he saw the garment immersed in blood, Dibra Torah Koloshim Nayadim, the Torah uses human language. A person would naturally come to the conclusion this was it, that Yosef was eaten. Although Halacha, there was no certainty. The only question one could raise is, this is before Matan Torah, but if this would happen after Matan Torah, how would it affect Nachlas? Apparently it wouldn't. It wouldn't affect inheritance. Would it affect the dinim of Avelos? Yaakov was in mourning, but again, it could have been in mourning not because of the halachic imperative that he goes through Avelos, but because it was his hergish that Yosef was gone. At any rate, this is no evidence that the fact that you could identify a garment, that it works halachically. It doesn't work halachically because it is still possible that it was borrowed.